Hey there, everybody. Mr. Lewis here again, ready to go through section 7.4 in AP HuG today. And in section 7.3, we learned about von Thunen's model, which was all about the most cost-effective, efficient, and profitable ways to use land. Those different parcels of land being either closer to the city center and smaller in area, or farther away from the city center and larger in area. But while von Thunen was concerned with the most profitable use of the land in terms of perishability, cost of transportation, and some other factors, one thing that he didn't really look at too closely was land variance. In other words, how the physical landscape of the earth can look very, very different in some areas versus others, and also how that climate can change. Meaning, some of those things we were looking at in von Thunen's model might not be all that realistic everywhere around the world. And this leads us into not only the different types of climates that we find and climates that are more or less conducive to certain crops, but also the different strategies, the different practices that are used around the world to farm different crops. So, without further ado, section 7.4, types of agriculture. Let's take a look. All right, so before diving into the more specific types of agriculture, we have to learn about these two broad types of agriculture, one being subsistence, one being commercial. Subsistence agriculture is, simply put, living off the land, farming to feed one's family, and using what's left over to trade for other necessities, perhaps. Commercial agriculture, on the other hand, is all about profit. It's business. Usually getting very, very good at farming one or two particular crops. This is what's known as monoculture, planting one crop over and over. Polyculture, on the other hand, will be rotating through various crops. But this is commercial agriculture, profiting from the sale of farm goods. Derwent Whittlesey is an important character in agricultural geography. He identified these 10 specific agricultural regions, some of them subsistent, some of them commercial, that we're going to look at throughout this section. Let's take a look at subsistence agricultural regions first. But before we do that even, remember we looked at this map early on in this unit at some of the different farming types we see around the world and where we see them around the world. And you get an idea for this color palette. This is what we would call an isoline map, right? It's using the different farming types and then outlining or isolating certain areas regardless of national borders. So nomadic hunters are often found in these very cold, almost Arctic regions, right? We would say just subarctic, basically. Nomadic herding is in this yellow region here. And so you can go through these different farming types, and I think this would be a helpful tool when preparing for the Unit 7 test and the AP exam. But nomadic herding, actually, or pastoral nomadism in general, is the first type we're going to see here today. Pastoral nomadism is found, as you saw on that map, mostly in Central Asia, Southwest Asia, and then North and Eastern Africa. Now, importantly, in North Africa, notice it's around the Sahara. It sort of borders the Sahara Desert there, and that's important because pastoral nomadism is a type of farming that occurs when land is too dry to actually cultivate crops. Pastoral nomadism is a dependence on herds of animals, okay, using those herds of animals, sometimes through hunting, sometimes not. And remember, this is what we call transhumance migration, when one migrates based on seasonal patterns. Usually this has to do with a herd of animals. And we've seen this throughout history, less today than, say, a few hundred years ago, but it does still exist. And it's more of a culture, a way of life, because it is your life, constantly traveling around based on this herd of animals, whether they're being hunted or otherwise. your day-to-day life is based on this herd. So we tend to find pastoral nomadism in Central Asia, Southwest Asia, North Africa, around the Sahara, East Africa, a little bit along the Arabian Peninsula here as well, right? And then in South Africa and up in the northern reaches of Scandinavia. The second type is shifting cultivation. Shifting cultivation deals with many, many different crops, planting all kinds of different crops on the same field. And it often involves a lot of slash and burn. Slash being clearing vegetation, clearing some very wooded, sometimes jungle-like areas, and then burning the vegetation after slashing it for fertilizer, right? To use those nutrients, to replenish the nutrients in the soil. And so this is oftentimes found in very densely vegetated areas, sort of like rainforests. And you can see where we find shifting cultivation on this map. These are sort of equatorial tropical regions, right? In the Amazon, portions of the Amazon in South America here, portions of Central America and southern Mexico, sub-Saharan Africa, and then Southeast Asia. So it makes sense that they would all fall along those same latitudinal planes because it deals with dense vegetation, rainforest-like regions. So that's shifting cultivation, very hot, humid climates, and a lot of thick vegetation that has to be cleared, and then many crops are planted within the same areas. Plantation farming is found in the areas you can see here on this map that are shaded a little bit darker. So Southeast Asia in small areas, right? Not all the way around Southeast Asia or Asia in general, but very specific regions. And the same thing goes for the east coast of Africa, and then a couple portions in Western Africa, the Caribbean, Central America, and some regions in South America, the largest of which on this entire map actually are along the east coast of South America, mostly in Brazil there. But plantations are defined by this interaction between highly developed countries and developed countries, less developed countries. And basically, much of the profits from plantation farming, which are these very, very large farms, most of the profits go toward these higher developed countries, but most of the labor is coming from the less developed countries. So this is one example of neo-colonialism, right? Where these highly developed countries aren't using any kind of military force here, but they are certainly using economic influence, and there's economic gain that is flowing back to those highly developed countries. And many people have protested this whole interaction on the basis that this is creating lower wages for these laborers in the less developed countries, and they're being exploited. And this, in many ways, contributed to the fair trade sort of movement, which kind of stamps companies that are, in their terms, for the fair trade movement itself, paying people what they should be getting paid, sourcing their goods in a more ethical way in their mind. So if you ever see fair trade coffee and things like that, because coffee is one thing that would get brought up in this conversation with plantation farming, coffee beans, that's where that comes from. That's where the idea of fair trade comes from. So very tropical regions usually we're talking about here. And plantations can take on many different forms, you guys. We talked about coffee. We've talked about banana plantations. We've talked about rubber plantations, which, it's weird that rubber grows on trees or seeps out of trees, but it does. And it's a very profitable industry, as you can imagine. It's used quite extensively in different products. So there are very large plantations to grow that rubber or those rubber trees. All right. Intensive subsistence farming is exactly what it says. Okay, we've learned what intensive farming is. We've learned what subsistence farming is. Intensive farming is very labor intensive, backbreaking sort of labor, right? Subsistence farming is growing food to feed one's family. So we're talking about very labor intensive farming that is done usually on small family plots of land to feed one's family and to use any remaining surplus, usually to trade for other basic necessities. So this is most commonly found in East Asia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. So very commonly along the Southeast Asian coast here, right? Throughout Vietnam is where this area would be. And then in Eastern China, Korea, Japan, and then India as well. And you're actually going to see an article about India tomorrow and what's going on there currently with some laws that have been changing that subsistence farmers who are in many cases doing intensive subsistence farming are very upset about. There are some protests currently happening in India as a result of these new laws about farming. So you're going to see a little bit more about that tomorrow. So that's intensive subsistence farming, and those are the subsistence farming examples. What about commercial farming? The first one we want to look at is commercial grain farming. We find this most commonly in North America, East Asia, and Europe. And North America is very good at this. We've seen grain farms throughout Indiana, throughout the Midwest. This is something that the United States specifically does quite well. And this would be more extensive sort of farming, right? So we're talking about things like wheat, rice, barley, millet, a lot of things that go into these human consumption products. And there's big money in this, right? This is agribusiness. This is agricultural business in its biggest form. This is big money we're talking about. So these farms, these big wheat farms, for example, they make a lot of money because it's low cost to grow. And these companies are paying top dollar to get this stuff. So this is for sale agriculture, right? We're talking about cereal, bread, these big companies and things that are consumed by many people across the world on a daily basis. There's a lot of mechanization involved in this. Because it is extensive farming, we've seen advancements in technology in this industry over time, and it's become heavily mechanized. Big pieces of equipment like you see here. What about Mediterranean and commercial gardening? So Mediterranean agriculture, we've discussed a little bit already actually. We see this a lot in Southern Europe along the Mediterranean Sea itself, but also in West Asia and the coast of the United States, California. All right, so these crops are usually for human consumption. We're looking at things like olives, grapes, and as discussed, the grape industry is huge in these regions in many ways because they contribute to the wine industry, right? Grapes, in most cases, are used to make wine, and the wine industries of Southern Europe and California are quite lucrative for those regions. So these are environmentally based, right? This is a very specific climate in these regions that happen to produce these types of crops, these types of goods. And again, this goes back to von Thunen's model, right? Not all climates, not all physical landscapes are necessarily conducive to growing certain crops. Commercial gardening is growing these fruits and vegetables for commercial gain, right? So we're looking at some areas here like the Southeast United States where we have very humid sort of weather. Sometimes in Southern Europe and California, of course, there's going to be humid weather, right? But in the Southeast United States, we're talking about a different ball game. These long, very hot, very humid growing seasons. And we see things like orange groves, right? Oranges are a very, very popular and profitable good that's grown in Florida specifically, but other parts of the Southeast. And so the Southeast United States is very well known for this sort of farm stand consumption, right? And a lot of the things you see in, say, orange juice or frozen fruit or canned fruit or many juices, a lot of that stuff comes from the Southeast United States, and there's big money in there when we're talking about big corporations like Dole, for example. Mixed crop and livestock farming is, again, sort of exactly what it says. Mixed crops and livestock. We're doing both, right? Growing crops like corn, soy, and then raising animals with them like cattle and pigs. And believe it or not, a lot of this corn and soy is actually grown to feed the livestock because the livestock can make the farmers more money. Okay, a lot of people don't realize that much of that corn and soy, while much of it does go into our food, a lot of it is actually being used to simply feed the cattle or pigs or whatever livestock is being raised on that particular farm. And we see a lot of this in the United States, right? Even specifically in Indiana and specifically in Crown Point. There are many mixed crop and livestock farms in Crown Point. We also see a lot of this in Europe. Dairy farming, as you know, deals with things like milk and cream and butter and all kinds of fun stuff like that. And when there are dairy farms near these markets, as we learned in section 7.3, they often are, these areas are called milk sheds, right? Because there is easily accessible milk, for one, near these markets. And whenever a market has a dairy farm very close to it or surrounded by many dairy farms, okay, this is what's known as a milk shed area. Now, these are highly intensive, okay, and that was another reason they were close to the city center in Von Thunen's model. But this is also a profitable industry, unfortunately, less so than it used to be. And many dairy farmers are leaving the industry. So this is a recent development, and the government in many ways has to support dairy farmers. We've seen this throughout history, and many of these dairy farmers are leaving the industry as it's become less profitable for them, less lucrative, or there's other industries that might be more lucrative. Finally, livestock ranching. Livestock ranching usually occurs in areas where the land simply can't support crops, right? It is non-arable, or sometimes it's too arid, it's too dry, but simply it's non-arable. It's not very farmable or fertile land. So we see a lot of cattle and chicken and pigs, things like that, animals that are raised for slaughter. And there's many different consequences of this. We've seen a huge growth in livestock ranching in less developed countries, but also it's led to a lot of land being converted, right? Land that has been altered in some way to try and improve it, but also as a result of the livestock itself, right? In some cases, it's a positive result. In some cases, it's negative if there are cases of overgrazing and that land becomes eroded, and then it's even less good than it was before, right? But in some cases, the land is positively changed because these areas that can't support crops, people have to figure out, how are we going to get water out to them? If there's not natural, if there aren't natural sources of water, how can we get better irrigation systems that might be able to supply these regions with water? So we've seen both good and bad consequences of livestock ranching. But again, a commercial industry, a very profitable commercial type of farming. All right, that is it for section 7.4. We'll move on to section 7.5 the next time we meet. and we'll get into the Green Wave, the different agricultural revolutions that have taken place both in world history, ancient world history, and modern times. So I look forward to that. Thank you, as always, for tuning in, and I'll see you next time to talk about Section 7.5. All right, have a good day, everyone. So long.